It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world seems to slow down just enough for you to catch your breath. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple before fading into a soft twilight. Evelyn Carter, the FBI director, was driving home after another long day at work. Her mind was still buzzing with the details of an ongoing investigation, but she welcomed the solitude of the open road. The highway stretched out ahead of her, empty except for the occasional car passing by. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. As Evelyn cruised along, her thoughts were interrupted by flashing red and blue lights appearing in her rearview mirror. She glanced up, surprised. Had she been speeding? She didn't think so, but it was possible. Sometimes the monotony of the drive lulled her into losing track of her speed. Without hesitation, she signaled and pulled over onto the shoulder, her tires crunching against the gravel as the car came to a stop. She turned off the engine and waited, watching the officer approach in her side mirror. The officer stepped out of his patrol car, his silhouette illuminated by the glow of his headlights. He adjusted his belt, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun as he walked toward her vehicle. Evelyn took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was likely nothing more than a routine traffic stop. She reached for her purse, intending to grab her driver's license and registration, when she remembered something important. She was the FBI director. This wasn't just any ordinary citizen being pulled over. It was her. Surely, once she explained who she was, the situation would resolve itself quickly. Rolling down her window, Evelyn greeted the officer with a calm smile. "Good evening, officer," she said politely, her voice steady despite the slight tension in her chest. "Is there a problem?" The officer leaned down slightly, peering into the car. His expression was unreadable under the brim of his hat, but his tone was clipped and formal. "Do you know why I pulled you over, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes scanning the interior of the vehicle. Evelyn shook her head. "I'm not sure. Was I speeding? If so, I apologize. I must not have realized." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he straightened up slightly, his posture stiffening. For a moment, Evelyn thought he might let her off with a warning or simply issue a ticket. But then something shifted. His demeanor changed, becoming more intense, almost confrontational. He pointed toward her hands, which were still resting on the steering wheel. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Evelyn blinked, caught off guard by the sudden change in tone. "Of course," she replied, raising her hands slightly to show they were empty. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on." But the officer wasn't satisfied. He moved closer to the car, his hand now resting firmly on the grip of his firearm. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice rising. "Now." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't how these things usually went. Normally, even if someone was pulled over for a minor infraction, officers remained calm and professional. There was none of that here. Something about this felt wrong. Still, she knew better than to argue. Slowly, carefully, she opened the car door and stepped out onto the shoulder of the road, keeping her movements deliberate and unhurried. "Ma'am, turn around and place your hands on the hood of the car," the officer instructed, his voice cold and unyielding. Evelyn complied, though her heart was racing now. What was happening? Why was this escalating so quickly? She tried to stay calm, reminding herself that she was trained for high-pressure situations like this. As she stood there, her hands pressed against the cool metal of her car, she decided to explain who she was. Surely, once the officer knew her identity, he'd realize this was all a misunderstanding. "Officer," she began, her voice measured but firm. "I'm Evelyn Carter. I'm the director of the FBI. I'm reaching for my credentials now to show you." Before she could finish, the officer shouted, "Don't move. Keep your hands where I can see them." His voice was louder now, filled with urgency and anger. Evelyn froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could hear the unmistakable sound of him drawing his weapon, the metallic click echoing in the stillness of the night. Time seemed to slow down, Evelyn's mind raced. How had this gone so wrong so fast? She hadn't done anything to provoke this level of aggression. All she'd done was pull over when instructed, follow orders, and try to explain herself. And yet, here she was, standing, on the side of the road, held at gunpoint by someone who didn't seem to care, or perhaps didn't know, that she was one of the most powerful figures in law enforcement. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, the person responsible for overseeing federal investigations and ensuring justice was served, and she was now the one being treated as a suspect. It was surreal, almost unbelievable. But there was no time to dwell on that now. Her focus had to remain on de-escalating the situation, on staying alive. As the moments dragged on, Evelyn became acutely aware of the growing number of spectators. Cars had begun to slow down as they passed, their drivers craning their necks to get a better look at what was happening. Some people pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Others called 911, reporting what appeared to be a dangerous confrontation between a police officer and a civilian. The presence of witnesses gave Evelyn a small measure of comfort, though she knew it wouldn't necessarily prevent things from spiraling further out of control. Despite the fear coursing through her veins, Evelyn refused to let panic take over. She focused on breathing deeply, keeping her voice steady and doing everything she could to communicate clearly. "Officer," she said again, her words deliberate, "please listen to me. I am the FBI director. I am not a threat. Let me show you my identification so we can resolve this peacefully." For a moment there was silence. Then finally the officer spoke, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Stay right where you are," he commanded, though the edge of hostility in his tone had softened ever so slightly. Evelyn nodded, even though he couldn't see her face. She remained perfectly still, waiting for whatever came next. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a night that would leave a lasting impact, not just on her, but on the entire nation. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Evelyn stood frozen, her hands pressed against the hood of her car, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The officer's weapon was still trained on her, and every second felt like an eternity. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of how this situation had spiraled so far out of control. She had done everything right, pulled over when signaled, followed instructions, and even tried to explain who she was. And yet here she was, held at gunpoint by someone who seemed unwilling or unable to process basic information. Evelyn knew better than to argue. In situations like this, staying calm and composed was crucial, but inside her thoughts were anything but serene. How could this happen, she wondered. She wasn't just any civilian. She was the FBI director, one of the most recognizable figures in law enforcement. Yet none of that seemed to matter to the officer standing behind her. His actions suggested he saw her not as a public servant, but as a potential threat. It was baffling and terrifying. As the seconds ticked by, Evelyn became increasingly aware of the growing crowd of onlookers. Cars slowed down as they passed, their drivers rubbernecking to get a glimpse of the unfolding drama. Some rolled down their windows to shout questions, while others whipped out their phones to record the scene. The flashing lights of the patrol car illuminated the faces of curious bystanders, casting eerie shadows across the highway. Evelyn could hear snippets of hushed conversations and the occasional gasp. She couldn't blame them for being shocked. It wasn't every day you saw someone in a position of authority treated this way. Despite the chaos around her, Evelyn focused on keeping her breathing steady. Panic wouldn't help her now. Instead, she tried to think strategically. If the officer refused to listen to her explanation, perhaps someone else would intervene. Surely one of the witnesses would realize something was wrong and call for backup. Or maybe another patrol unit would arrive soon, drawn by the commotion. Either way, Evelyn clung to the hope that reinforcements would come before things escalated further. Her prayers were answered sooner than expected. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night air. A second police car sped onto the scene, its lights flashing wildly as it screeched to a halt behind the original officer's vehicle. Two officers stepped out, their expressions tense as they took in the sight before them, their colleague with his weapon drawn, and Evelyn, still pinned against her car. One of the responding officers immediately recognized her. "Director Carter?" he exclaimed, his voice filled with disbelief. He exchanged a quick glance with his partner before stepping forward cautiously. "What's going on here?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Evelyn exhaled sharply, relief washing over her. Finally, someone who understood the gravity of the situation. She turned her head slightly, careful not to make any sudden movements, and addressed the new arrivals. "I was pulled over for what I assume was a routine traffic stop," she explained, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "But things escalated quickly. This officer drew his weapon and ordered me to stay put." The responding officers exchanged another glance, this one laced with concern. One of them approached the original officer, speaking quietly, but firmly. "Holster your weapon," he instructed. "We need to de-escalate this situation immediately." For a moment, the original officer hesitated, his grip tightening on the firearm. Then reluctantly he lowered it and stepped back, though his posture remained rigid and defensive. The responding officers wasted no time in taking charge of the scene. One of them positioned himself between Evelyn and the original officer, creating a physical barrier that served as both protection and a clear message. The situation was under new management. With the immediate threat neutralized, Evelyn was finally allowed to step away from her car. She straightened up slowly, her muscles stiff from holding the same position for so long. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her purse to retrieve her credentials. "Here," she said, handing them over to the responding officers. "This should clear things up." The officers examined the ID carefully, their expressions softening as they confirmed her identity. "Director Carter, we apologize for this misunderstanding," one of them said sincerely. "We'll get this sorted out as quickly as possible." Evelyn nodded, though her expression remained guarded. While she appreciated their professionalism, she couldn't shake the lingering unease that had settled in her chest. Misunderstandings happened, yes, but this had gone far beyond a simple mix-up. There was something deeper at play here, something that needed to be addressed. Meanwhile, the original officer began to defend his actions, his tone defensive and tinged with frustration. She reached for something in her purse. "I thought she might be armed," he insisted, gesturing toward Evelyn. "I was following protocol." The responding officers listened patiently but exchanged skeptical looks. One of them asked pointedly, "Did you verify her identity before escalating the situation?" The original officer hesitated, his confidence wavering. I didn't have a chance to check," he admitted reluctantly. "But given the circumstances," the responding officer interrupted, his voice firm. "You should have prioritized verifying her identity before resorting to force. That's standard procedure, especially in cases like this." The rebuke was subtle but unmistakable. The original officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado crumbling under scrutiny. It was becoming painfully clear that his handling of the situation had been reckless at best, and potentially dangerous at worst. As the responding officers continued to assess the scene, Evelyn took a moment to collect herself. She leaned against her car, her legs still unsteady beneath her. Despite the resolution of the immediate danger, she couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was emblematic of larger issues within law enforcement. How many others had faced similar treatment, not because of who they were, but because of implicit biases or lapses in judgment? And what did it say about the system when even someone in her position wasn't immune to such treatment? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. One of the responding officers approached her, his expression apologetic. "Director Carter, we're going to need a full statement from you regarding what happened here," he said gently. "But first, are you okay? Do you need medical attention?" Evelyn shook her head, managing a small smile. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied. "Just shaken, understandably. I'd like to give my statement now, if that's all right." The officer nodded, guiding her to the back of one of the patrol cars where they could speak privately. As they walked, Evelyn glanced over her shoulder at the original officer who was now being questioned by his colleagues. His body language spoke volumes. He looked uneasy, almost guilty. Whatever excuses he might offer, Evelyn knew the truth. This never should have happened. Sitting down on the curb, Evelyn recounted the events leading up to the confrontation, her words measured and precise. She described how she had complied with every instruction, how she had attempted to identify herself, and how the situation had escalated unnecessarily. The responding officer listened intently, jotting down notes as she spoke. When she finished, he thanked her for her cooperation and assured her that the matter would be thoroughly investigated. By the time the questioning wrapped up, the initial shock had begun to wear off, replaced by a simmering anger. Evelyn knew she couldn't let this slide, not just for her own sake, but for the countless others who might find themselves in similar situations without the privilege of her title. This wasn't just about her. It was about accountability, transparency, and ensuring that no one else had to endure what she had tonight. As the responding officers escorted her back to her car, Evelyn made a silent vow. She would use her platform to shine a light on the flaws within the system, to push for reforms that would prevent incidents like this from happening again. Because if this could happen to her, a high-ranking official with decades of experience in law enforcement, then no one was truly safe. The night air was cooler now, and the highway had transformed into a makeshift stage for an unfolding drama that no one could have predicted. Evelyn stood beside her car, her hands crossed in front of her as she watched the responding officers take control of the situation. The original officer, who moments earlier had been so adamant about his actions, now looked like a man caught in headlights, unsure, defensive, and increasingly uneasy. His colleagues were questioning him with sharp precision, their tone leaving no room for excuses or half-truths. Evelyn couldn't hear everything they were saying, but she didn't need to. The body language alone told the story. One of the responding officers turned toward Evelyn briefly, offering her a reassuring nod before returning to the conversation. She appreciated the gesture. It reminded her that there were still good people in law enforcement, individuals who genuinely cared about doing the right thing. But even as she acknowledged this, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of frustration bubbling beneath the surface. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who might not have someone step in to diffuse such a volatile situation. What if she hadn't been recognized? What if the responding officers hadn't arrived when they did? These questions haunted her. As the minutes passed, the crowd of onlookers began to disperse. Some drivers had already left, satisfied that the immediate danger had subsided. Others lingered, eager to see how things would play out. A few curious bystanders approached cautiously, asking whether they could help or offering words of support to Evelyn. One woman, clutching her phone tightly, asked softly, "Are you okay, ma'am?" Evelyn nodded, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied. "Just shaken." The woman hesitated, then said, almost apologetically, "I recorded some of what happened, if you need it for evidence or anything." Her voice trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Evelyn felt a pang of gratitude. In a world where trust in institutions was eroding, these small acts of solidarity meant more than words could express. She thanked the woman warmly, promising to follow up if necessary. Meanwhile, the investigation into the incident continued. The responding officers had separated the original officer from Evelyn, ensuring there was no further interaction between them. They took detailed statements from both parties, though it was clear where their sympathies lay. Every time the original officer tried to justify his behavior, his explanation seemed weaker, less convincing. At one point, he argued that he had acted based on instinct, claiming he had felt threatened by Evelyn's movements. But the responding officers weren't buying it. "Let's be clear," one of them said firmly, his voice low but authoritative. "You're telling us you didn't verify her identity because you thought she might pose a threat. Is that correct?" The original officer nodded hesitantly. "Yes, sir. I followed protocol, I assessed the situation and acted accordingly. The responding officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Assessed the situation? You mean you ignored basic procedures? When dealing with a traffic stop, verifying identity is step one. It's non-negotiable, especially when the person in question cooperates fully, as Director Carter did. The rebuke stung, and the original officer shifted uncomfortably under the weight of scrutiny. For the first time since the confrontation began, Evelyn saw cracks in his armor. He wasn't the confident, authoritative figure who had drawn his weapon moments earlier. Instead, he looked uncertain, almost ashamed. Whether it was genuine remorse or simply fear of the consequences, Evelyn couldn't tell, and honestly, she didn't care. What mattered was accountability. While the officers continued their inquiry, Evelyn took a moment to reflect on the broader implications of what had happened. As FBI director, she had spent years advocating for transparency and reform within law enforcement. She had pushed for better training, stricter accountability measures, and policies designed to reduce incidents of excessive force. Yet here she was, standing on the side of the road, having experienced firsthand the very issues she had worked so hard to address. It was humbling and infuriating. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. The responding officers approached her again, this time holding a clipboard. "Director Carter," he said respectfully, "we've gathered enough information to begin an internal review of this incident. We'll also be filing a formal report with your agency. Rest assured, this won't go unnoticed." Evelyn nodded, appreciating the effort but knowing full well that reports and reviews often led to little more than lip service. "Thank you," she said evenly. "But I'd like to emphasize something. This isn't just about me. If we don't address the root causes of these kinds of incidents, the biases, the lack of proper training, the failure to de-escalate, then nothing will change. And that's unacceptable." The officer regarded her thoughtfully, his expression softening. "You're absolutely right, ma'am. We're committed to making sure this doesn't happen again to anyone." It was a promise Evelyn wanted to believe, but skepticism tugged at her. Promises were easy to make. Delivering on them was another matter entirely. Still, she resolved to hold them, and herself, to account. This incident wasn't just a personal affront. It was a wake-up call. If she, as FBI director, wasn't immune to being treated as a suspect, then systemic change was long overdue. As the scene wound down, the responding officers escorted the original officer back to his patrol car. His demeanor had shifted noticeably. He was quieter, more subdued. Whatever bravado he had displayed earlier had evaporated under the harsh light of accountability. Evelyn watched him go, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, relief, and determination. Anger at the injustice of the situation, relief that it hadn't ended in tragedy, and determination to ensure that this wouldn't happen to anyone else. Before leaving the scene, Evelyn exchanged a few final words with the responding officers. They thanked her for her cooperation and assured her that the matter would be handled swiftly and thoroughly. She appreciated their professionalism, though she knew the real test would come in the days ahead. Would there be meaningful consequences for the original officer, or would this fade into obscurity, dismissed as an isolated incident? As Evelyn slid back into her car, exhaustion washed over her. The adrenaline that had kept her going during the confrontation had worn off, leaving her drained. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, taking a moment to collect herself before starting the engine. The dashboard clock read 10:47 p.m., far later than she had expected to still be awake. The quiet hum of the highway surrounded her once again, but the peace she had felt earlier was gone. Tonight, the road felt different, heavier. Driving home, Evelyn replayed the events in her mind, analyzing every detail. She thought about the original officer's actions, the responding officer's intervention, and the reactions of the bystanders. Each piece of the puzzle revealed something troubling about the state of law enforcement, not just in this particular department, but across the country. Bias, fear, and poor judgment could turn routine interactions into life-threatening situations. And while training and policy changes were essential, they weren't enough on their own. Real change required a cultural shift, a recognition that protecting and serving meant treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of circumstances. When Evelyn finally pulled into her driveway, she sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the house she called home. The lights were on inside, casting a warm glow through the windows. It was a stark contrast to the cold reality she had faced on the highway. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked up the path to her front door. Inside, her family greeted her with concern and relief, having heard bits and pieces of what had happened. Evelyn hugged them tightly, grateful for their presence. Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Evelyn made a decision. This incident wouldn't define her, but it would shape her. She would use her experience to advocate for reforms, to push for greater accountability, and to remind everyone that no one was above scrutiny, not even those sworn to protect and serve. Because if the system failed someone like her, it could fail anyone. And that was a truth too, important to ignore. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of activity, both public and private. News of the confrontation spread like wildfire, fueled by social media posts from bystanders who had witnessed the scene on the highway. Grainy videos captured on cell phones showed snippets of the tense standoff. Evelyn standing at her car with her hands raised, the officer's weapon drawn, and the eventual arrival of backup units that diffused the situation. Headlines blared across newspapers and online platforms, each one more sensational than the last. FBI director held at gunpoint during traffic stop, read one. Officer faces scrutiny after confrontation with top law enforcement official, declared another. Evelyn woke up to a flood of notifications on her phone the morning after the incident. Reporters were already calling, texting, and emailing seeking comments and statements. Colleagues within the FBI reached out as well, offering support and expressing outrage on her behalf. Some even suggested she take legal action against the officer involved. But Evelyn wasn't ready to make any decisions yet. Her priority was understanding exactly what had happened and why. By mid-morning, an internal investigation into the traffic stop was underway. The responding officers had filed their initial reports, detailing the sequence of events and highlighting the original officer's failure to follow proper protocol. Meanwhile, the department where the officer worked launched its own inquiry, aware of the scrutiny they were now under. Local news stations sent reporters to the police station, demanding answers. Protesters gathered outside holding signs that read, "Accountability now," and "Justice for all." The pressure mounted with each passing hour. As part of the investigation, Evelyn was asked to provide a formal statement. She agreed, knowing it was critical to set the record straight. Sitting in a quiet conference room at FBI headquarters, she recounted every detail of the incident, from the moment she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror to the point when the responding officers arrived and took control of the situation. Her tone was calm but firm, her words measured and precise. She didn't embellish or exaggerate. Instead, she stuck to the facts, painting a vivid picture of how quickly the interaction had escalated and how unnecessary it had been. "I identified myself multiple times," Evelyn explained, her voice steady despite the weight of the memory. "I told him I was the FBI director and reached for my credentials to prove it. At no point did I resist or act aggressively, yet he drew his weapon and treated me as if I posed an imminent threat." Her account was corroborated by witness statements and video footage collected from the scene. One bystander, a young man who had recorded much of the confrontation, described feeling terrified as he watched the officer point his gun at Evelyn. "She was just standing there doing what she was told," he said during an interview with a local news channel. "It didn't make sense. Why would anyone treat someone like that?" As the evidence piled up, cracks began to form in the original officer's defense. His claim that he felt threatened seemed increasingly flimsy, especially given Evelyn's compliance throughout the stop. Investigators dug deeper, reviewing his personnel file and discovering a troubling pattern. Over the years, several complaints had been filed against him for excessive force and aggressive behavior during traffic stops. Most of these cases had been dismissed due to lack of evidence or insufficient follow-up, but taken together, they painted a concerning picture. One particularly damning incident stood out. A year earlier, the officer had pulled over a young woman for a minor infraction and allegedly shouted at her, accusing her of hiding something in her car. When she protested, he allegedly grabbed her arm forcefully, leaving bruises. She had filed a complaint, but it was ultimately dropped after she decided not to pursue legal action. Reading through the report, Evelyn felt a surge of anger, not just for herself but for all the other individuals who might have been mistreated by this officer without recourse. The mounting evidence led to swift action. Within 48 hours of the incident, the department placed the officer on administrative leave pending further investigation. This decision sparked mixed reactions. Some praised the move as a step toward accountability, while others argued it was too little, too late. Critics pointed out that similar incidents involving civilians often resulted in far less decisive action. If this is how they handle things when it's someone powerful, one commentator remarked on a live TV segment, imagine what happens when it's someone without influence. For Evelyn, the disparity was glaringly obvious. She couldn't help but think about the countless stories she had heard over the years. Stories of ordinary people pulled over for minor infractions, only to find themselves subjected to humiliating searches, unwarranted aggression, or worse. How many of those cases went unreported? How many victims were too afraid to speak up, fearing retaliation or disbelief? The thought weighed heavily on her. Determined to use her platform to amplify these voices, Evelyn held a press conference 2 days after the incident. Standing behind a podium adorned with the FBI seal, she addressed the nation with a mix of resolve and vulnerability. Cameras flashed as reporters leaned forward, eager to capture her every word. Last night, I experienced something that no one should ever have to endure. A routine traffic stop that turned into a dangerous and dehumanizing encounter, she began, her voice strong but tinged with emotion. What happened to me is not unique. It reflects broader issues within our law enforcement system. Issues that we must confront head-on if we are to build trust between communities and those sworn to protect them. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. This is not about singling out one individual. It's about addressing systemic problems, implicit bias, inadequate training, and a culture that sometimes prioritizes authority over empathy. These issues affect us all, regardless of title or position. And until we tackle them, incidents like this will continue to happen. Her speech struck a chord. Social media exploded with reactions, ranging from praise for her courage to calls for immediate reform. Activists seized the moment, organizing rallies and town hall meetings to discuss policing practices and demand change. Politicians issued statements condemning the officer's actions and pledging support for new legislation aimed at increasing accountability. Even some members of law enforcement spoke out, acknowledging the need for better training and oversight. Behind the scenes, Evelyn worked tirelessly to ensure the momentum didn't fade. She met with senior officials within the FBI and other federal agencies, urging them to collaborate on initiatives that would address the root causes of such incidents. She pushed for mandatory de-escalation training, stricter protocols for verifying identity during traffic stops, and independent review boards to investigate allegations of misconduct. Her efforts weren't always met with enthusiasm. Some resisted the idea of additional oversight, but she refused to back down. Meanwhile, the investigation into the officer's conduct continued. Evidence from the scene, witness testimonies, and his disciplinary history all pointed to serious lapses in judgment. By the end of the week, prosecutors announced that criminal charges would be filed against him for misconduct and misuse of authority. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community, reigniting debates about police accountability and justice. For Evelyn, the news brought a measure of satisfaction, but also sadness. While it was important that the officer faced consequences for his actions, she knew punishment alone wouldn't solve the larger problem. True change required more than holding individuals accountable. It demanded a fundamental shift in how law enforcement operated. As she reflected on the past few days, Evelyn reminded herself of why she had chosen this career path in the first place: to serve, to protect, and to make a difference. Now, more than ever, she was determined to honor that commitment, not just for herself but for everyone who deserved to feel safe and respected. The weeks that followed the incident were transformative, not just for Evelyn, but for the nation. The story of an FBI director being held at gunpoint during a routine traffic stop had ignited conversations that many people had long avoided. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like Justice for All and Reform Now, as ordinary citizens shared their own experiences of unfair treatment by law enforcement. For every person who spoke out, there were dozens more who nodded in silent agreement, their stories untold but no less significant. Evelyn watched it all unfold with a mixture of hope and determination. She knew this moment couldn't be wasted. It had to lead to real, lasting change. The criminal case against the officer moved swiftly through the courts. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, witness testimonies, video footage from the scene and records of past misconduct that painted a damning picture of his behavior. During the trial, the officer attempted to defend himself, claiming he had acted out of fear and confusion. He argued that the stress of the job clouded his judgment and that he hadn't intended to escalate the situation. But the jury wasn't swayed. After deliberating for less than 2 days, they returned a guilty verdict on charges of misconduct and misuse of authority. The judge sentenced him to prison, emphasizing the importance of accountability within law enforcement. "Your actions betrayed the trust placed in you," the judge said sternly, and they underscored the need for reform. While the sentencing marked a victory for accountability, Evelyn understood that justice wasn't just about punishing one individual, it was about addressing the systemic issues that allowed such incidents to happen in the first place. In the aftermath of the trial, she threw herself into advocacy work, using her platform to push for meaningful reforms. She partnered with civil rights organizations, community leaders, and lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at improving policing practices. Together, they proposed measures such as mandatory de-escalation training, independent oversight boards to investigate complaints, and stricter guidelines for when and how officers could use force. One of the most significant initiatives Evelyn championed was the creation of a national database to track instances of police misconduct. This idea stemmed from her discovery of the officer's history of complaints that had gone largely ignored because there was no centralized system to monitor patterns of behavior. With a database in place, departments across the country would have access to critical information about officers' conduct, making it harder for problematic individuals to move from one department to another without scrutiny. It was a bold proposal, met with resistance from some corners of law enforcement, but Evelyn refused to back down. "Transparency saves lives," she declared during a televised interview. "We owe it to the public to ensure that those entrusted with power are held to the highest standards." Her efforts didn't stop at policy changes. Evelyn also focused on education and awareness, traveling across the country to speak at conferences, schools, and community forums. Her message was simple yet powerful. Empathy must be at the heart of law enforcement. Being a police officer isn't just about enforcing laws, she told a packed auditorium in Chicago. It's about serving people, with respect, dignity, and compassion. Every interaction matters. Every life matters. Her speeches resonated deeply, inspiring both civilians and officers to rethink their roles and responsibilities. Of course, not everyone agreed with her approach. Some critics accused her of undermining law enforcement, arguing that increased oversight would make officers hesitant to do their jobs effectively. Others dismissed her as biased, claiming she couldn't understand the challenges faced by rank-and-file officers because of her high-ranking position. Evelyn listened to these criticisms carefully, acknowledging the concerns while standing firm in her convictions. "I'm not anti-police," she clarified during a panel discussion. "I'm pro-accountability. We can support our officers and hold them accountable at the same time. In fact, accountability makes them better at what they do." Despite the backlash, Evelyn found immense support from unexpected places. Many officers reached out to her privately, expressing gratitude for shining a light on issues they had struggled with for years. "We want to do the right thing," one veteran cop wrote in an email, "but sometimes the system works against us. Your voice gives us hope that things can improve." These messages reinforced Evelyn's belief that change was possible, if people were willing to come together and demand it. As months passed, the ripple effects of the incident became undeniable. Cities and states began implementing some of the reforms Evelyn had advocated for, including body cameras for officers and stricter protocols for verifying identity during stops. Training programs emphasized de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity, helping officers build trust within the communities they served. Media coverage shifted too, focusing less on sensationalism and more on solutions. Journalists highlighted success stories where collaboration between law enforcement and civilians led to safer neighborhoods and stronger relationships. For Evelyn, the progress was heartening, but she remained vigilant. Change didn't happen overnight, and setbacks were inevitable. There would always be those resistant to reform, clinging to outdated practices or fearful of losing control. But Evelyn believed in the resilience of the human spirit. She saw it in the faces of protesters marching peacefully, in the courage of victims sharing their stories, and in the determination of officers striving to do better. Each act of bravery, no matter how small, brought them closer to a future where no one had to fear being treated unjustly. On a personal level, the incident left an indelible mark on Evelyn. Though she had always been passionate about justice, this experience deepened her resolve. It reminded her that even someone in her position wasn't immune to injustice, and that privilege alone couldn't shield anyone from systemic flaws. She carried that lesson with her every day, letting it guide her decisions and fuel her advocacy. One evening, several months after the incident, Evelyn sat on her porch watching the sunset. The sky was streaked with hues of orange and pink, mirroring the colors she had seen on the night of the traffic stop. But this time the scene felt different, peaceful, reflective. She thought about everything that had transpired since then, the trials, the protests, the reforms, and allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. They hadn't fixed everything, not yet, but they had started something, and sometimes starting was enough. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, she noticed a neighbor walking by with her young daughter. The girl waved shyly, and Evelyn smiled, waving back. As she watched them disappear down the street, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, but she was ready to walk it, one step at a time.